If you've been to the grocery store lately, you've probably noticed that prices are still rising, often sharply. Ground beef and chicken prices are up by more than 10% this year. Coffee prices have climbed nearly 15%, and egg prices have skyrocketed, up by more than 27% this year. But this isn't just a U.S. problem. Globally, the Food and Agriculture Organization's Food Price Index has climbed sharply over the past year, with notable spikes in prices for meat, dairy, vegetable oils, and especially cocoa. So, what's behind these rising prices, and are they likely to come down anytime soon? Hey everyone, and welcome back to Global Insights. I'm Noah Zerbe. I'm a professor of international relations at California State Polytechnic University Humboldt. In this episode, I'm going to break down the 5 key drivers behind the global surge in food prices and explain why many of those higher prices are likely here to stay. Let's start with the most fundamental and perhaps the most unsettling driver of rising food prices: climate change. We're seeing a growing number of extreme weather events disrupting food production across the globe. Droughts, floods, wildfires, and unseasonable temperatures are hampering crop yields, increasing volatility, and driving up prices at nearly every step of the food chain. In the United States, prolonged droughts in California and the Southwest are shrinking harvests of vegetables, nuts, and fruits. In West Africa, soaring temperatures have devastated cocoa production, driving up chocolate prices by as much as 300% in some markets. In India and Southeast Asia, heat waves and erratic monsoons are threatening rice production, prompting export bans that ripple across global markets. And these aren't isolated incidents. Climate scientists have been warning for years that agriculture is uniquely vulnerable to climate volatility, and we're now seeing that play out in real time. The problem is that even small shifts in temperature or rainfall can disrupt harvests. And when this happens across multiple regions all at once, as it increasingly does, the result is a cascade of price spikes, shortages, and panic buying. But it's not just about the weather. Climate change is also disrupting infrastructure, damaging irrigation systems, roads, and storage facilities that farmers rely on. And it's reshaping the global geography of food production itself, forcing shifts in where and how crops can grow. Political scientists often talk about environmental externalities, costs that aren't reflected in the price of the goods that we consume. Climate change is perhaps the ultimate example of that. For decades, the global food system has operated as if climate stability were a given. Now that assumption is crumbling, and prices are rising as a result. The bottom line is that a hotter, less predictable climate means less reliable food production and higher, more volatile prices. The second major factor driving food prices higher is geopolitical conflict and the trade disruptions that come with it. Most people are aware of the impact of Russia's war in Ukraine. Together, Russia and Ukraine account for about 30% of global wheat exports. They're also major suppliers of corn, sunflower oil, and fertilizer. So when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, global grain shipments were thrown into chaos, sending prices for bread, cooking oil, and animal feed soaring. This especially affected countries that rely heavily on imports from these regions, countries like Egypt, Lebanon, and Bangladesh. Even though exports have resumed, the war continues to limit agricultural production, damaging infrastructure and disrupting global supply chains. In addition, Russia has weaponized food exports, imposing temporary bans on wheat shipments and pulling out of grain corridor agreements, adding even more uncertainty to already fragile markets. But the war in Ukraine isn't the only conflict that's reshaping global food trade. In the Red Sea, attacks on commercial shipping by Houthi militants in Yemen have forced many vessels to reroute thousands of miles around the Cape of Good Hope. This adds time, fuel costs, and insurance premiums to shipments of grain, coffee, sugar, and other staples. These longer, riskier trade routes delay food reaching markets, driving up prices along the way. And then there's the rising number of food export bans as countries facing shortages domestically move to protect their own populations. India, the world's largest rice exporter, imposed restrictions on rice exports in 2023 and again in 2025 with the goal of controlling domestic food inflation. And Indonesia has threatened to impose restrictions on palm oil exports. These kinds of policies tend to tighten global supply and drive up prices elsewhere. What all of this shows is that food markets don't operate in isolation. They're deeply entangled with global security, conflict, and state power. When geopolitical tensions rise, it's not just oil and natural gas markets that feel the impact. Food systems do too. In international relations, we often describe the global economy as interdependent but insecure. Food is a perfect case in point. A war in Europe, a blockade in the Red Sea, a policy change in Asia, all of it affects what we pay at the grocery store. And as geopolitical instability becomes more common, we can expect more frequent, more unpredictable, and more prolonged shocks to the global food system. Even when crops grow as expected and trade routes stay open, there's still another layer to the food price puzzle: rising input costs and persistent supply chain strain. Every item we eat, whether a loaf of bread or a carton of eggs, relies on a complex network of inputs: fertilizers, animal feed, fuel, packaging, labor, and transportation. When the cost of any of these inputs rises, those increases get passed directly on to consumers. Look at fertilizer. Global fertilizer prices soared in the wake of the Ukraine war, largely due to sanctions on Russian natural gas, a key input for nitrogen-based fertilizers. Prices have moderated somewhat, but remain well above pre-pandemic levels. And when fertilizer costs go up, farmers are either forced to cut back on use, lowering their yields, or raise their prices to cover the cost difference. Then there's fuel and transportation. Rising diesel prices mean higher costs for everything from tractors in the field to refrigerated trucks to container ships. Add in persistent shipping bottlenecks left over from the pandemic-era port backlogs and now amplified by the conflict in the Red Sea, and you'll see that supply systems are more expensive and less reliable than ever. In political economy, this is a powerful example of what's known as weaponized interdependence. The concept describes how the very interconnectedness of the global economy can be turned into a tool for state power. Countries that control critical resources or key transit routes, like Russia with natural gas or militant groups in the Red Sea, can manipulate supply chains to exert political leverage. The very networks that once promised greater efficiency now become conduits for conflict, turning distant geopolitical decisions into real-world costs for farmers and consumers. Animal feed prices have also climbed, especially for corn and soy. That directly impacts the cost of meat, dairy, and eggs, products that depend on grain-intensive livestock operations. And finally, food production is labor-intensive at nearly every stage, from harvesting crops to processing meats to stocking shelves. Labor shortages and logistics, some of them driven by restrictive immigration policies, other by low wages and poor working conditions, have pushed costs higher across the supply chain. What we're seeing here is a kind of cost contagion, where one link in the supply chain becomes more expensive and the entire system feels its impact. It's a textbook example of cost push inflation, where higher input prices lead to higher final prices for consumers. And while some of these costs fluctuate, like fuel, many others, especially labor and infrastructure, are much stickier. The global food system is built on just-in-time efficiency, but in a more volatile world, that efficiency is increasingly coming at the expense of resilience. Unlike tech or finance, the food system doesn't move at the speed of markets, it moves at the speed of biology. And that's also a big part of why food prices aren't coming down anytime soon. Let's start with meat and dairy, where we're seeing some of the sharpest price increases. In the United States, cattle herds are at their lowest level in decades. Years of drought in key ranching states like Texas and Kansas have dried up grazing lands and pushed up feed prices. In response, ranchers have been forced to reduce herd sizes. And rebuilding those herds takes time, measured in years, not months. You just can't turn a dial and produce more beef. The same goes for poultry and eggs. A series of deadly avian flu outbreaks has wiped out tens of millions of egg-laying hens over the past couple of years. While producers have begun to recover, the effects are still being felt. Egg prices rose more than 25% over the past year in the US alone. And because biosecurity protocols are stricter now, recovery times are slower and more expensive than in the past. These aren't isolated events. They're a symptom of deeper structural fragilities in the food production system. Modern agricultural systems are highly specialized, capital-intensive, and geographically concentrated. That makes them very efficient, but also somewhat brittle. For example, the consolidation of the meatpacking facilities in the United States means that a disruption to just one or two plants due to labor shortages, disease outbreak, or equipment failures can ripple across the entire country. And climate stress is making things worse. Droughts in California aren't just reducing crop yields, they're also drying up groundwater reserves, which farmers had long relied on to cushion against dry years. And as those reserves run out, the long-term agricultural capacity is coming under threat. This all points to a key insight from political economy. Some shocks are reversible, others are structural. When a supply chain falters, it can often be fixed, but when the underlying productive base erodes, herds shrink, land degrades, or ecosystems collapse, that takes much, much longer to repair. So while demand may fluctuate, the supply side of the food system is under real long-term pressure. And that means higher food prices are likely to stick around. While biology and ecology might constrain how much food we can produce, politics and policy shape how that food is distributed, priced, and regulated. And that brings us to our fifth and in many ways most avoidable driver of rising food prices, which lies not in the weather or in distant war zones, but in policy choices made here at home. In the U.S., the food system is shaped by a complex web of tariffs, trade rules, labor policies, and corporate regulation, and many of those rules are making the problems worse, not better. In recent years, escalating trade tensions, especially with China, have led to import taxes or tariffs on key inputs like fertilizer, machinery, and even on certain foods themselves. These tariffs raise costs for farmers and food processors, and ultimately for consumers. What begins as a geopolitical strategy ends up at the grocery store checkout. But tariffs don't exist in a vacuum. When the U.S. imposes tariffs on other countries, those countries often retaliate with tariffs of their own, many of which target U.S. agricultural exports. In the context of the ongoing U.S.-China trade war, for example, China slapped tariffs on American soybeans, pork, and other farm goods, canceling trade contracts and decimating export markets for U.S. producers, prompting billions of dollars in federal bailout payments. These retaliatory measures disrupt global supply chains, reduce market access for U.S. farmers, and add yet another layer of volatility into already stressed food systems. What begins as a trade strategy quickly turns into a lose-lose scenario where both producers and consumers bear the costs. Agriculture in the United States depends heavily on migrant labor, but restrictive visa systems, aggressive deportations, and political uncertainty have led to widespread labor shortages, especially during peak harvest seasons and processing periods. According to data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, more than 40% of the crop farm workers in the United States lack legal work authorization, and foreign-born workers, including both authorized and undocumented individuals, make up the vast majority of the U.S. agricultural labor force. The increasing arrest and deportation of farm workers is, not surprisingly, having an impact on U.S. farm production. The resulting labor shortages are already leading to crop losses as farmers are unable to find a sufficient workforce to bring in their harvests. Further, facing unstable and a shrinking labor force, many farms, particularly those growing labor-intensive crops, could be forced to reduce their acreage under cultivation or cease operations altogether. This would decrease domestic production of fresh fruits and vegetables or force farmers to shift to less labor-intensive crops. And all of this contributes to higher food prices. Further, a handful of firms dominate nearly every link of the food chain, from seeds and fertilizer to meat processing to supermarket retailing. The four largest companies control more than 60% of the global seed markets and 75% of the agrochemical markets. Meat processing is also highly concentrated, with the top four firms accounting for about 85% of beef, 70% of pork, and 60% of poultry processing. And supermarkets are similarly concentrated, with the top 4 firms controlling about 65% of all U.S. grocery sales, and Walmart alone accounting for more than a quarter of that. That level of concentration gives these firms enormous pricing power, especially during periods of supply disruption. Some economists refer to this as greedflation, the idea that firms are using the excuse of inflation to raise prices beyond what's necessary to cover production costs. Whether that's intentional or just the logic of market concentration, the effect is the same. Consumers pay more while profits surge. This corporate power also manifests itself in a more subtle form you've likely noticed: shrinkflation. That's where the price of a product stays the same, but the amount that you get for your money goes down. Think of it as a lighter bag of chips, a thinner chocolate bar, or a cereal box with a bit more air inside it. Shrinkflation is a way for companies to pass on their own rising input costs without the sticker shock of a direct price hike. In a highly concentrated market where you have fewer alternative brands to switch to, it becomes easier for companies to make these switches without losing customers. And finally, the recent shutdown of the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, which oversaw U.S. food aid programs, has also created uncertainty for American farmers. For decades, U.S. food aid programs served as a major buyer of U.S. food. In 2024 alone, USAID purchased more than $2 billion worth of food commodities from U.S. farmers. While these sales represent a relatively small portion of overall production, the sudden loss of a major buyer will only increase uncertainty for farmers. And all of this reflects a deeper truth about the political economy of food. Prices aren't just the result of natural forces. They're shaped by human decisions, institutional structures, and power dynamics. We often talk about the food system as though it were a neutral market, but in reality, it's a system governed by politics and policies, protected by subsidies, and structured by corporate interests. And when these systems fail to adapt or prioritize profit over resilience, it's ordinary people that pay the price. So let's take stock. Food prices aren't being driven higher by a single bad harvest or a one-off shock. They're being driven higher by a perfect storm of pressures: a changing climate that makes agriculture less predictable, wars and geopolitical tensions that disrupt trade, rising costs across the supply chain, structural limits on how quickly production can rebound, and policy choices, especially in the United States, that often make the system more fragile than more resilient. And here's the uncomfortable truth: most of these drivers are structural, not temporary. Even if inflation flows, prices are unlikely to go back down to where they were just a few years ago. Instead, what we're seeing is a new normal, one where food is more expensive, prices are more volatile, and everything is just more politically charged. And that has huge implications, not just for our grocery bills, but also for global politics. Rising food costs are already fueling protests, reshaping trade relationships, and deepening inequalities within and between countries. History shows us that food insecurity can be a powerful spark for political instability. Indeed, the politics of food is often the politics of survival. And in an era of climate change and global instability, understanding those politics is more important than ever. But I'd love to hear what you think. Which of these drivers do you see as most important, and which do you think policymakers should focus on first? Let me know in the comments section below, and if you found this breakdown helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Thanks for watching.